Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab, all on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
My name is JUDD DEVERMONT, and I am the director of the Africa Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, a think tank in Washington, D.C. And it is my honor to welcome you to Impossible Choices, the conundrum facing African governments in a time of global crisis. This is a joint event with the One Campaign, and I'm delighted to co-host this conversation with my friend Gail Smith. The COVID-19 epidemic, the COVID-19 pandemic is an economic crisis as much as it is a health one. While many of the region's countries have responded admirably to the economic shocks, there is simply no way to protect their economies, care for their citizens, and fulfill their debt obligations all at once during this pandemic. Zambia's default of one of its Eurobonds last Friday is the first, but probably not the last case of an African country suffocating under the weight of its bilateral, multilateral, and commercial debt. And because this is very complicated with foreign bondholders, bilateral governments, including China, and international financial institutions involved, it's really easy to gloss over that these decisions have real world impacts. Gail and I feel very strongly that it's time to stop talking in the abstract and start tackling these debt issues head on. And the best way to do that, in our opinion, is to ask our panelists and you, our audience, to put yourselves in the shoes of African finance ministers and governments. We want to show how they are facing really impossible choices and underscore that it's urgent that we commit to extend debt service suspensions and press all stakeholders to show some flexibility in these negotiations. Today, we're going to walk you through two scenarios, and you'll have the opportunity to vote via the website Poll Everywhere. To take part in this exercise, and I will explain this again and again, but to do this, there's going to be instructions on the screen. You just need to go to pollev.com/AILA. Once again, pollev.com/AILA, or text AILA to 22333. And that's all you need to do to join and vote. So while you figure out the tech, let me introduce our panelists. KADER HASSANE is a senior investment director at Africa 50 Investment Fund. He is a native of Niger, recognized expert in infrastructure development with 15 years experience. Prior to Africa 50, he worked for a Denam capital platform, Greenwish Partners, leading projects in West and Central Africa. He also worked for the World Bank Global Infrastructure Facility and the African Development Bank. Dr. Diane Keita is the Deputy Executive Director for Programs, the UN Assistant Secretary General at the UN Population Fund. She recently served as Guinea's Minister for Cooperation and African Integration. She's held UN leadership positions in New York and at the country level, serving as a UNDP Deputy Representative in Africa and in the Caribbean, as well as representative to the African Union. She's also served as a UN Population Fund representative in Mauritania, Benin, Nigeria, and the DRC. We're also joined by RIMA Lukugeka. She is the director of the African Department in the African Department in the French Development Agency, the AFD. As a director, she manages the workload for the continent, and that alone accounts for 50% of all of AFD's total commitment. Before she took over as the head of the African Department, she worked on infrastructure projects, including telecommunications, energy, transport, and digital networks. And my co-host needs no introduction, but I will do it anyway. Gail Smith is the president and CEO of the One Campaign. She previously served as USAID administrator. She was a special assistant to President Obama and senior director for development and democracy at the National Security Council. And earlier, she was the special assistant to President Clinton and senior director for African Affairs at the National Security Council. Before she served at the NSC, she founded the Sustainable Security Program at the Center for American Progress and co-founded the Enough Project. Gail, I'm thrilled to do this with you, and let me turn it over to you for some opening remarks and to introduce our first scenario.
Great, thank you, Judd, and thanks everybody for joining us. I want to give a special shout out to our panelists who have agreed to be in the hot seat as we hopefully demonstrate that we are not in a moment where there's a door number 3 with easy and effective options. So we've all got to do much more to create that space. What we're going to do today is slightly different than your usual event. We thought that we all spend a lot of time on Zoom calls and need to spice it up. But we hope at the end of the day, this will make starkly clear that we are at risk of not providing the options that are needed and having one pandemic with 2 standards. If you think about what wealthy countries have been able to do to manage the economic shock, it's our strong view we've got to create the same space for developing and middle income countries. So here we go. And remember that you get to vote. And like voting is really important. And we will remind you throughout how you do that. And as Judd and I have agreed, we're counting all the votes. So scenario 1, panelists, it's debt repayment time. You are the finance minister of a fictional lower middle income African country. Your country faces increasing COVID-19 cases, a 25% drop in key commodity prices, and tourism is nearly bottomed out. Your consumer inflation rate has jumped to 10%, and you're experiencing a 5% drop in remittances and FDI. And your credit rating has been downgraded from stable to negative. Government debt as a percentage of GDP is projected to grow by 70% by 2022. In the middle of all this, you've got the next debt repayment coming up. Your country hasn't participated in the Debt Service Suspension Initiative, or DSSI, because you've heard or seen countries' credit ratings being downgraded if they join. So here's the immediate scenario. It's January 2021. You've now got your next round of debt repayment to all international creditors. And you owe multilateral banks 60 million, 150 million to commercial creditors, and 50 million to bilateral creditors. Fortunately, the G20 countries have agreed to extend the DSSI for the world's poorest countries, but only until the end of June 2021. So you only need to repay 210 million. But what are your choices? Would you, option 1, default on your loans and risk having your credit ratings go down, which means less access to future financing? Or would you prioritize your debt repayments and try to find money elsewhere to fill the gap and risk not being able to fund a COVID response on the economic side or on the health side? And what would the implications be? So first, DNA, it's over to you. What are you going to do?
Thank you so much, Kaylee. Well, I think it's an absolutely impossible situation and very difficult situation for the Minister of Finance. It's a dual challenge of public health emergency and economic crisis, and in the face of a looming debt repayment January. That's not the way to celebrate the new year. So there is various options, of course, that can be looked at, and depending of the creditor. But first, as a Minister of Finance, I'll go to see what are the global trend that we use usually with the AU, see where we stand as agenda, because that's been taken as a global initiative, and the UN Economic Commission for Africa to see what the reasons of delay are. But to be very clear, I will definitely make sure that I will go and ensure that the COVID challenge is being implemented. We have no choice, because the cost of inaction, of delay are multifold and extend beyond the health consequence, with the mounting death, irreversible economic losses, and increased poverty and hunger and social instability. For me, where I sit, I think it will be important, better, cheaper, and probably more effective to respond to the pandemic immediately. Because if we delay action, not only we will shift the burden of to the future, but the price of the response will also exponentially increase. as the crisis cascade and reverberate for years to come. While doing that, I'll try to negotiate the debt. We all saw Zambia not long ago, and it's threatening to all of us. And for me, that would be the good way to think, because not only COVID-19 is not a great equalizer, unfortunately, on the contrary, those who are already left behind, I mean the most vulnerable, often suffer the most. So the discount need to be inclusive at the country level, of course, the minister, all the parliamentarian, because this we need to mobilize domestic resources, and yet we need to ensure that our creditors, private and public outside the country, need to understand we need a global solidarity. And before stopping, I think this is so important because the gain that we have made advancing social and economic development over the years are at risk, which will be absolutely detrimental for the women, adolescent girls who have been disproportionately affected by the crisis. You all know that the pandemic and associated risk of movement severely disrupt their access to life-saving health services. And the country we talk in Africa, the Sahelian country, for instance, the life-saving health service, including sexual reproductive health, is difficult to access even in normal time, let alone in this difficult time. And of course, it has exacerbated gender-based violence as well. So I will negotiate. Credit may take me down, but I will negotiate with them. But there is only one condition, though. Only one. I need to show them that I'm transparent, that I'm not going to steal that money to do something else, because this is the time to be clear about that, and and move forward and give them, showcase every single month I have to. I will stop there for the time being to let.
No, it's a great answer, and I think the hard choice that you are landing on is to generate and deliver the financing needed to manage the pandemic because it's urgent. Try urgently to negotiate something on the debt side, but you're still going to be in that scenario at risk of default. I think one important piece I'd also like to elevate before turning to RIMA is that you are saying, as part of a global deal, we will put transparency on the table. It remains to be seen whether that's going to be enough. So here is one hard choice that ends up with option number one. Okay, RIMA, you are now the finance minister. What are you going to do?
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much. It's really a very tricky question because there is no appropriate response to this dilemma, as it has been already said. If we have an insufficient response to the health and the economic shock, it might lead to more damage to the real economy, with an increased delinquency and bankruptcy and deeper sector-specific shocks. So this is what we would like to avoid, as you know. And as you know, also, like most African countries, our fiscal space is very low and not enough to address the current shock. You may also know that the share of government revenue compared to GDP is around 50% in our country, which is far below the share needed to address all standard expenses and not at all exceptional expenses. So on the one hand, if we default on our loans and have our credit rating downgraded, this may have an important impact on our future access to market financing. So, and it may reduce our capacity to fund the future economic needs. And on the other hand, if we prioritize debt repayment, hence keeping our access to the market, we do not fund a proper health response to the COVID crisis, which is not a choice, I think. So this means that we need to seek other alternatives and be able to address both, because both dimensions are related. Low health leads to low human capital and weak economies, and at the same time, low level of growth leads to low employment and low wages and a weak quality of life. So alternative could exist. I was thinking about similar action. First, try to negotiate the commercial and private debt more seriously. Secondly, maybe try to postpone other non-priority expenses in the budget, other spending, non-COVID investment. Third, maybe try to mobilize additional local funding, such as the transfer from the diaspora. So maybe they could help also. And fourth possibility would be to see whether we can seek additional financing from local public banks. We have strong public local banks. They could help in financing our short-term need. So maybe I will stop there and see what other colleague would propose. Thank you.
Thank you, Rima. And I think you get to the real dilemma we face, because I think your answer is that, but I have to do 1 and 2, and we need an option 3. And I think this just makes clear that absent an option 3, I heard you say it would be unacceptable to not finance the COVID response. If you've only got 2 choices and you have to fund the COVID response, then you're looking at all of the impacts that you outlined that could occur if you lose access to future financing. So I think yours is an answer that makes very clear, you know, this expression being stuck between a rock and a hard place. That's exactly where we are. So KADER, you know all about finance. You're an expert in all of this, but you're not right now in your current position. You are the finance minister and you've got to make a choice. What are you going to do? Yep.
Indeed. And I think what you said about being in a rock and a hard place is it's a truism here. Look, I'm not going to rephrase what everyone has said about this being an impossible choice. We all know that. And I think, Judd, if you had said, what would you do as president, it would be different. But I expect that in cabinet, you're going to have the finance minister on one side and you're going to have the health minister on the other side. And those are going to be 2 different answers. If I am finance minister, what is my utmost and foremost responsibility? It is to safeguard the financial standing of my country. That is my role. That is my job. Now, when faced with 2 evils, we must find a way to pick the lesser of the 2. And in my view, of the 2 questions that are posed here, one is slightly lesser than the other, and it is to pay your debt and pay your creditors. And I'll tell you why I take this view. Because if you respond to the COVID in the scenario that you've outlined, you're defaulting. And if you're defaulting, that has consequences. If you pay your debt, you may find another way to respond to the COVID by different mechanisms. But the cost for me as finance minister of not paying your debt, especially for African countries, which have spent the past 20 years trying to be more transparent, having IFRS standards, our books in order so we can access the market. And at the first possible crisis, what do? We say, well, we can't pay you back. The consequences will be severe. But one thing I will do in the scenario you've outlined, I will only pay commercial creditors. I will default on the 60 million of multilaterals. Reason being, commercial creditors have an outsized or oversized impact on credit rating agencies. So that is an immediate downgrade, a severe one, and a contraction to your access to liquidity in the future. Multilateral are somewhat driven by a separate agenda, and I feel that the negotiation at that level would be different. In terms of implication, one thing important is I would not worry so much about the statistics, the 70% debt to GDP ratio you've outlined. We don't have the basis, so we don't know where that would increase, but clearly it will increase because your GDP is going down and your revenues are going down and your debt is increasing. But as we've seen, I think the World Bank states that until you're at 77% or so, you're not in high risk of debt distress. So you do have a little bit of room to be, as I like to call it, to be in overdraft. So the problem is not being in overdraft once in a while, is to live in overdraft, to use that analogy. I would say, I'm sorry, I'm contrarian a bit here, but as finance minister, I feel like I almost have no choice.
No, I think this is a great answer. And I think one of the things you point to that makes this a really, not just an unfair situation, but a non-viable situation, is your point about if you're the finance minister, your job is to protect the long-term health of the financial system and the economy. So you sort of have to take the step you propose. And I like your variation. You pay off the commercial creditors and tell the multilaterals just to sit tight. But that does put you into contradiction with the health minister. And one of the things we've learned over the years, I remember many years ago when the Economic Commission for Africa convened Africa's finance ministers and health ministers together to take a look at how to deal with the AIDS epidemic from a financial and a public health perspective at the same time. And that was a really key turning point. I think what you've highlighted here, though, is that you're between a rock and a hard place, and then there's another rock inside the rock and another hard place inside the hard place, because you are setting up a scenario where a country has to choose between its health and what the health minister is mandated to protect, and the finance minister and what he or she's mandated to protect. So I think it's a great answer. Now, remember, everybody can vote, and we're going to be coming back to some of these. But now we're going to go to another scenario. I'm going to turn it back to Judd. And let's keep going at this rock and a hard place.
Thanks, Gail. Why don't we pull back up the voting on scenario 1 and just see how our audience did. And I would say that, our panelists, took both position A for Dene and position B for KADER, and RIMA, you kind of made yourself a third position, but the audience picked 63% would support defaulting on the loans, and about 37% said they would prioritize debt repayment. So let's keep that in mind as we move to scenario 2, and we're gonna increase the stakes a bit. So in scenario 2, the health and the debt crisis worsen. There has been a rapidly escalating outbreak of COVID in your capital city, which is stretching your hospitals to the limit. Spending 15 million would enable you to put up a field hospital that could treat thousands of patients within weeks, but you would be unable to meet your debt repayment, and you would risk defaulting, and you would also be exposed to a credit rating downgrade. So what would you do? Would you go ahead and spend 15 million on a field hospital, default on your loans, or would you keep the money for debt repayment and try to find a new loan to fund the hospital, which would push back treatment for months? So again, you'll have the opportunity to vote. Some of you have already started, and then we'll come back and see the results. But first, Dina, why don't we go to you first for your response on this question?
Thank you. Thank you. The life of the Minister of Finance does not go alone. It is a part of a government. And as such, the decision is collegial. So that's why he may not win all the time. And this situation is not becoming more easier because the decision is being taken to really to put in favor the social aspect of the agenda, while you cannot default your debt payment continuously. You need to make sure that you have some, it's a trade-off. You have a bargain, you have something to give to your debtor. So that's why I mentioned earlier, how do you make that the rest of the society, the parliaments, and also the private sector, the local one, can contribute and assist. And for that, to be able to do that, countries need something. They need really population data very quickly to know what is the problem. I truly believe that we need to build the hospital to make sure that to leave no one behind. I think it's very, very important to ensure that the life-saving aspect is important. But if you want to show your face as Minister of Finance outside the country and make sure that you are not into the red and incapable of moving forward, we have seen that, then that's the negotiation time. That's the negotiation with the partners. And that's where this international solidarity and the national one, and insist, domestic resources are important. Domestic resources are important. Maybe that's the time to allocate all domestic resources, even if the fiscal space is small, to what matter most, and ensure that we lessen or we keep the debt manageable, if it can be manageable at that level. Because what we're talking about here is not a public health crisis only. Because of what is happening, you have all the large bulk of young people, not having a job. There is so many things at stake at the same time. You have so many, and the Minister of Education does not do what to do with the education side of the job. There is no tele-schooling in my country. You can't. There's no tele-schooling, doesn't work. So how do we do that? And that needs to be put in favor of debt repayment. So that's why I said this is the time where good governance is important, where transparency is important. So with international lenders, for some now, African debt is interesting for some of the lenders. Unfortunately, that's sad to be said, but it exists in some part. I mean, this is the time to make sure that your internal governance, that's what will save you, is really transparent, open, and allow you to negotiate with policymaker, of course, and with the international committee and the private sectors. That I would say at this level, but I stick to my social policy because there's too many implications, not only health, education, and all the rest, and that we need to move forward on it. I would stop there for the time being, but good governance and transparency for me, absolutely key.
I really like the way that you made this personal, right? The finance minister can look at spreadsheets and negotiate in paneled rooms, but he still or she has to get into her car and engage in her community or his community. And that personal element of this is exactly what I think we're trying to do. The other thing that I thought was so important that you mentioned is that it's not just the health impacts and the financial impacts. It's how this affects education. It's how it affects, you didn't say this, but I will, how do you allocate your security forces when it comes to lockdowns? I mean, there's a whole host of things that this brings together, and to make it through this crisis, good governance and transparency has to be at the heart of it. Rima, let me turn to you for your thoughts.
So thank you, Jude. I think it's a big dilemma. It's not easy to answer both questions. Both options will have difficult impact on either the economy or the population. If we build the field hospital that will enable us to treat thousands of patients within weeks and save these lives, but we default on our loans, get our credit rating downgraded, and lose our access to the market. So this is difficult to support. And on the other hand, if we keep the money for debt repayment, hence avoiding defaulting and keeping our access to the market, but we delay the funding of the hospital and push back treatment and risk thousands of lives. So if I have personally to make a choice, I would opt to saving the life of our population and hence building the field hospital. But once again, our country shouldn't be put in a position to choose between health and economics. They should choose between fulfilling their legal obligation or using that money to tackle the impact of COVID-19. So we need to see other options to address all three needs, address short-term health needs, address the needs of the economy and mainly the SME, and fulfill our local obligations through maybe negotiation. So maybe we can try to avoid making a choice and explore a mix of solutions with external support. So we can seek maybe additional multilateral and bilateral supports. IMF and the World Bank and bilateral support has been proposing some additional financing. So maybe if needed, we can seek additional support from them. And once again, we need to pursue our negotiation for the rescheduling of the private and commercial debt. So I will stop here.
Rima, you set us up nicely as we start to sort of transition out of the artifice of the scenarios into real world challenges and looking for third ways and options, because these are, as the event is titled, impossible choices, and we have to be more creative about how do we think through addressing, financial responsibilities, but also the health. What I would like to do is we're gonna show the votes for this second segment, and then I'm going to hand it back to Gail to bring us into reality, and we'll give KADER another chance to share his thoughts. So, this is interesting. We now have, well, the money has been, we saw 46% said they would prioritize debt payment and try to find the money elsewhere. And then the second, we had 54%, so they would keep the money for debt repayment and try to find the loan to the hospital. So in both of these cases, looking for different options to try to scratch both of these itches. Gail, why don't I hand it back to you for any thoughts, and then we can kind of get back to reality.
Yeah, we've kind of been dancing in reality. Now we want to shift a little bit to, okay, so what do we do about it? Because what we've just gone through with these scenarios, these are the choices that people are left with right now. And I think we would all agree, even if we're voting, that it's which is the lesser of two evils, because to have to choose between the health and well-being of your people or the health and well-being of your economy, upon which those same people depend, is a choice that no one should have to make. And I throw out just a couple of other things. If you look at the United States, if you look at Europe, we have ripped up the rule book across the board because of the extreme urgency of this pandemic and the huge scope and scale of the economic shock. So I think we've got a scenario in the world where the orthodoxy that has guided much of our policy thinking has been put aside because, oh my God, we've got to do something quickly. I think what we are saying in the case of low-income countries, and quite frankly, low middle income countries in Africa, that there needs to be that same flexibility. And it's the right thing to do because they too have been hit by this external shock. It's also the smart thing to do because asking countries to make the choice between health and the health of your people and the health of your economy is to put countries on a road to ruin. And particularly in all the progress we've seen over the last 25 years. So what do we do? Our thinking is, first of all, this DSSI, this 6 months at a time, that's ridiculous. We know that this impact is going to be felt, so let's just bite the bullet and extend it. There's also discussions y'all may be aware of about the IMF issuing special drawing rights, which would provide some liquidity. But when it comes to the creditors and how we deal with it there, the private creditors are a really tough nut to crack. And frankly, they are not compelled in the same way that bilateral creditors might be, or we hope multilateral creditors will be. And credit agencies, meanwhile, are talking about downgrading or threatening to downgrade countries that are looking at debt suspension. So what do we think about the private creditors? They've got advantages in legal jurisdictions over countries that are in this predicament, like every country on the planet. This is not mismanagement. This is a pandemic. KADER, what's your view on this? If you were to make a compelling case to private creditors, or if you were to say to private creditors, maybe we need to light a little bit of fire underneath and put some pressure on, how would you make the argument that it's in their interest and the world's interest to move a little bit on this and give some other choices to finance ministers that have got tough ones in front of them?
Ooh, thank you, Gail. It is, it's very, very, let me first outline that it's very, very difficult. And then maybe spend a bit of time to explain why it's difficult, because sometimes what I hear is people putting, private creditors with sort of a mold of very greedy individuals. People need to understand the stakes, who are private creditors and what are the consequences. So in the hierarchy of creditors to a country, you would have multilateral, as I said earlier, they mainly have a development agenda. You can deal with them. You have bilaterals who do things because they like you as a country and because of relationship you may or may not have, and there are other things at play. Commercial creditors are looking at this from a business transaction, a purely business transaction. And to make an outline, a decade ago, African countries were very, very difficult for them to go to the market. And there's all these studies about the World Bank, the African Development Bank. If you take just the African infrastructure needs in the 90 to $150 billion a year. So you can only fund this, and I mean essential services, water and so on, for your population not to die. You can, to fund these, you need commercial creditors. So a lot of work was done to get those commercial creditors to come and lend to these countries. And we told them as African countries, listen, you're lending to a country that is transparent, that is well governed, that is very serious. You will get repaid. Your debt is at the top of the pile because it's sovereign backed, and so on and so forth. At the first sign of crisis, our response cannot be, we won't pay you, because the consequences means exactly what we're trying to avoid by people dying. People have to make that link. But more importantly, why are commercial creditors refusing? To make an analogy, take a bank. They've lended, okay, so if one country defaults on 20 million, that's not bad. But as a bank, you have to take objective measures, and you cannot segregate between different countries. So what the pain has to be the same for everyone. So if you let one default, then the others will as well. And if you have 20 countries defaulting, what does that mean for the bank? If it's a very solid bank, and a lot of them are not now since the 2008 financial crisis, the liquidity ratios have increased tremendously. What that means for the bank is loss of profit, okay, but it also means a liquidity issue, which may lead to fines and may lead to bankruptcy. So the commercial creditors are also looking at it from a survival standpoint, which is why the discussion about, oh, why won't you guys forgive this? They'll tell you, look, I'm a bank. I respond to shareholders. My survival is at stake. I'm not a country which can just roll this into the next 5 or 10 years. So if we approach this from this basis, we will approach it via like a commercial transaction, one devoid of emotions. The bankers always say, to quote them, you must pay to play if you wish. So if you want, for example, a longer grace period on a deal, that may reflect itself on the interest rate you have. What I would encourage us to have is to have a pragmatic conversation and telling commercial creditors, okay, I would like a rescheduling of my debt, but then we have to give something in exchange. Maybe that means in the interim, we'll pay the interest. Maybe that means a ratchet in the interest so that the bank at the end finds its way in a liquidity situation that's not worse than what it was before, but there must clearly be a consequence, which is why my personal view is that we're approaching commercial creditors the same way we're approaching bilateral and multilaterals who have a completely different agenda. Yeah. And until we realize that, it's going to be very, very difficult to bring them on board. And they're well within their rights. I would also maybe segue into a slightly different conversation. This may be an opportunity, you said it earlier, to be innovative. Well, we have been championing an asset recycling program, for example. You get those, which I think has been done to some success in Australia. This is, and life gives you lemon, you make lemonade. So this might be an opportunity to try something like this. I'm not saying sell the crown jewels of the country, but you could talk to these commercial creditors about an asset recycling program that will inject liquidity into the system without you having to default. But going and saying you need to hold off is too easy, and the consequences are dire.
That's so interesting. Sounds like you've dealt with some commercial creditors in your lifetime. But I think there are a couple really key points here. Someone once told me, talk to people where they are, not where you think they should be. And I think that's basically what you're advising here, is that to get this discussion going with private creditors, first understand where they're coming from, which is a bottom line perspective. But I think second, your last point is really key. There may be some innovative ways to deal with this. And I think there's mutual interest, frankly, on both sides of not seeing a succession of defaults. And so the question needs to become, how do we prevent that? And what's the comparative advantage of countries and of the commercial creditors? I would just say in terms of the G20 and places to encourage this, I think our hope would be that there would be a bit more active encouragement, if not convening and other things, that gets the finance ministers, the African governments that need to break through on this, and the creditors in the same room, not simply to have a talk shop, but to start working through, okay, what are the options? So very practical, let's just get this done. All right, let us turn now to our other two panelists. So we know that the G20's done some good work in extending the DSSI by 6 months, but we also know that we're still going to face this same problem during the second half of next year. So we've talked about how we've seen Zambia be the first in the queue for what could happen for many, and its default, it probably won't be the last. I would ask you, as we come near to the end of this, what's your analysis? What do you think the G20 and other donors and private creditors in the private sector need to do to support this broader effort in the standstill in particular? What would you like to see come out of a G20 summit? What do you want to hear from them? What's leadership look like to get this done? And let me start. DNA?
Well, thank you, Gailey. Since I'm on my real seat, if I may put it that way, and even if I put my chapeau of former Minister of Cooperation, it's an African integration. It's important here to really see the solidarity working. This is not a one country talk. Nobody, no wise finance minister or Nostradamus has seen this coming. No one. And it's really impacting the whole world. I think that's why this panel is absolutely essential, and really the choice of panelists is amazing. But we're just out of the UN-led meeting with the global leaders on how to tackle the finance and the COVID. So you're more than timely. In less than a month again, there will be a real Minister of Finance meeting on this very same issue to avoid the January discussion and the scenario we're playing. So for me, as you rightly put it, Gail, we need to work in the real world of today that was not planned 12 months ago. That is as simple as that. The talk need to change. As we talk today, Africa has mobilized against this pandemic. You have 41 countries out of the 54 that have done the socioeconomic impact assessment, and 37 a national response plan to fight it, with the help of the World Bank, the UN, all of us. And the UN has really been doing a great job on that. Well, but the fact is, we deal with saving lives, we deal with saving livelihoods, and as long as the pandemic is here, the vaccine are not for tomorrow, even though we have happy news coming. We have the threat of death, job losses every day, and the livelihood is destroyed. We are talking about Africa, but yet in New York you have 7,000 of shops closed, and that's the the free world, the modern world. So the fiscal space available for government, it's very, very small for them, but they need it to provide essential public good. So how do we do that? Negotiation, discussion from where I sit with all the creditor and probably the private. I like what HASSANE said. I like his sharpness in being, private sector minded. And I like that because the world is not one side, it's both sides. But my side is important was people first, people first. I need African median age for young people is 19-year-old. That's a continent, the median age is 19. 19. If you let them go now, what are we going to do in the next 10 years for development? So if you ask me, it's negotiation. The next Minister of Finance, they should sit together. Africa first should show solidarity. I agree with the jewel of the crown, as you said. There are so many of those countries, they have that. I agree with that, but yet we need to remain to stick to the national response plan and ensure that all sectors are being accounted for. It's not a Minister of Finance only job. That's not true. Being part of a government, this is a teamwork. You have a prime minister, you have a president. He needs to make choices. He has been elected not by the creditor, by his population, to whom he said, look, I'm going to save your life to give you a new world. He needs to be kept, or she. There are not many, unfortunately, in the continent. And just by the way, you will not gain that in the world. The women minister of finance or foreign affairs, they are doing very well. And the head of state, women are doing very well, very, very well in this respect everywhere. So, you know, that should be a lesson. Maybe we should be not talking about minister of finance, but probably head of states, because in this case, no minister of finance has the last word. This is the head of state, their responsibility before the world. That's why I think two prime ministers, Canada and Japan, with our UN Secretary General, put everyone together before their reality. Now, I like very much innovative response. And for me, the path to recovery should be always people-centered. People-centered with a strong deepen and expanding on social protection. The green transition. How do you think about the Sahel country? You know, Sahel for Sahel, with the crisis, the security and everything, if you don't balance the green transition, the climate change within that Sahel. And of course, the digital. I think digital is very important. Access, connectivity, and digital finance. If we want innovative, how can we promote that to get that closer to the population, to the village? And I will stop by what I start with, inclusive and transparent governance. You know, it's time for countries to stop fooling people around and making sure that every penny spent is accountable and can be accounted for. Thank you.
No, thank you. Thank you. Okay, Rima, give the G20 their instructions. What would you like to see?
Thank you, Gail. And thank you for the two other interventions. Very, very interesting indeed. So from my perspective, I think we need to look at a mix of solutions, multiple solutions, and I will propose 4 of them. I think there are a lot of other solutions, but I will speak about 4 of them. The first one is about what we already said, the private creditor. So, as we know, so far, private creditors have done little to support the African country. Despite many discussions with the G20, there was no progress on their participation in the DSSI. So I think we need to identify a global solution where we can propose a win-win solution for the private creditor, and maybe thinking about a mechanism that could reflect the terms of the G20 moratorium, and covering on the first side a restructuring of the debt terms on the duration and grace period with a moratory period, and secondly negotiating even the interest rate and focusing maybe this restructuring on lower income country where the debt is unsustainable. And to be able to do this, the question is whether we need like an international guarantee schemes allowing the coverage of the country risk, and maybe this would encourage private creditors to reschedule. This is a question, an open question. It could be a way of getting to a solution, a negotiated solution. Secondly, I think we didn't mention this issue, but I would like to mention it. I think there is also a need to negotiate with credit rating agency and ask them to commit to not downgrading countries that are asking for the debt suspension. Negotiations are going on between the G20 and credit rating agency to convince them of not downgrading countries that are asking for the debt suspension. And this will be very important. It should be possible to think of a mechanism that could allow country to take the debt service suspension without losing their credit rating. Third proposal is related to international support and donor support. We need to keep them providing financial support to country to enable the funding of the health and economic recovery. Because I think even in 2021 and even post the health crisis, there is a huge need for the economy. We estimate that sub-Saharan African country will be facing a substantial funding need, not only on the short term, but also in the medium term to answer the COVID-19 pandemic. And without the assistance from the international community, many countries will be forced to undertake far deeper adjustment, which would jeopardize growth. IMF estimates the need between 2020 and 2023 around 800 billion. So it's a huge amount, and maybe over half of it could be financed by private sector, and maybe 1/3 of it could be financed by international funding. So the remaining gap should be financed by local participation, either public financing or maybe seek public-private schemes for investment. So there is a need to think about all this financing gap and who will finance what. And fourth proposal will be about the reforms needed within the countries themselves. So we need, like it has been said before, we need to encourage African country to make the reforms, the internal reform on the financial and budgetary issues. We spoke about transparency. There is also a need about optimizing public spending, and as I said before, seeking maybe PPP schemes for some public investment. And maybe we didn't discuss this issue. There is also room for increasing fiscal revenue. So this also would be an action, a possible action with African countries. So I will stop there. I think there are many other innovative action to explore, but I think we need also to have maybe an international conference on the solution with African countries themselves proposing some solution. I will stop there.
No, thank you for that. And I think it's really interesting, because if I were to try to pull some threads and see if we can weave anything together out of this, I'd start with your last point, that there clearly needs to be an action forcing event to move some of these initiatives forward and ensure that there is a third option, right? Other than the two that you all have been forced to choose between. The G20 meetings are helpful, other things are helpful, but unless there's a dedicated moment, there's a little bit of a risk of incrementalism that I don't think is going to get us there. I think the second thing I would point to, and this has been raised several times, is the issue of transparency. It's a matter of good governance. It's a matter of public confidence. It's also a matter that is hugely important in terms of debt transparency. All the more important that the calls from transparency are coming from the countries themselves as opposed to the donors. That makes a big difference. And so I think that's going to be key. I think that what we are concluding needs to happen to shape this third option. First, you've all referenced in some ways to negotiations, right? Everybody's got to come into the room. I think taking the point about the private creditors, talking to people where they are rather than where they should be, put the numbers on the table and toss the ideas around. And again, negotiate a solution that captures the health of the people and the health of the economy, looks at the short-term urgency, but also paves the way for a sound medium to long-term economic and social future, right? That I think that can ultimately be achieved. But I think one of the most exciting things is the number of references to looking at all of the tools in the aggregate, right? Whether it's guarantees, whether it is some of the things that you referenced, KADER, on the asset side. There are things that can be done that may go beyond what we usually think about. And this could be a moment. I'm the eternal optimist, which during 2020 I have found to be absolutely a matter of urgency and sanity. But there is that adage that out of crisis, some good things can come. And you've talked about, greening economies. We've talked about managing some of the underlying challenges on debt and debt distress. We've talked about transparency. We've talked about the better and more strategic use of a broader range of tools than we usually think about, and some frank negotiations. I think we know what we need. Hopefully what we will see is an answer to that demand coming from enough of the world's leaders. And I hope Africa, speaking as a bloc, which it is increasingly doing, I think, to great effect, that might get us there. Because that's what we need, is our door number 3. With that, Judd, let me turn it over to you for any closing comments, but thank everyone. I think this has really been an important discussion to drive home 2 key points. The status quo, where we're between a rock and a hard place, is not good enough. And it's not good for Africa, but it's not good for the rest of the world either. But the other point is there is a door number 3. There is a third option that we can come up with. And I hope that all of us will, by whatever means we use as advocates, academics, policymakers, take advantage of the opportunity, put that third option on the table. So thank you to everyone, and over to my friend Judd.
Gail, thank you so much. Thanks to our panelists. This has been a really enriching conversation. I'm really writing notes as we moderate for things that I want to follow up on, but everyone brought so many good ideas. So I just want to foot stomp everyone's point, and particularly Gail's, around transparency. We didn't talk much about China during this conversation, but clearly that is one place where transparency needs to increase. And I think that the African governments need to be the ones to call for that from both from all of their partners. I think this point about bringing every actor in, and Rima, I love the point about how do we get the credit agencies in part of this conversation and to solve that. And then finally, making sure that African governments are leading this conversation, I think, is so critical. So if we approach this with creativity, with innovation, as Gail says, rip up the playbook and the rule book, and we can make through this problem. But we can't stick to the old lines that we have lived in pre-COVID. So let me thank our audience for joining us, and for all the panelists. And this was fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.